Okay, the Battlefield 5 trailer dropped a few weeks ago. I'm probably late to the party, but let's get on with this. What is up, guys? It's Blacklight Studios here, and we are on the topic of Battlefield 5. Now, I know E3 just happened and they showed a different trailer, but I must specify that we are only talking about the original trailer because I couldn't get this video in time. So, with that in mind, let's get on with it. Before we begin, I have to specify I have no problem with female characters in video games. It's just when they're presented poorly, like Battlefield 5, is where I have a problem and many others have a problem as well. Here's my problem with the trailer. I like studying World War II, but I would not consider myself an expert by no stretch of the imagination. However, I do know that people with prosthetic arms and women, specifically for the Allies, unless you were a Soviet, were not allowed to fight on the front lines. The Soviets were the only country to allow women to enlist as frontline soldiers. If you wanted to show women fighting in World War II, why didn't you show French resistance or the Soviet Union? World War II as a subject needs to be handled with care and respect because nearly 70 million people lost their lives, both military and civilians lost their lives in this conflict. And the good majority, not all, but most of the people who lost their lives were white and male. The average lifespan of a soldier was 23 years old. Let that sink in. If you're older than 23, you probably would not have lived through World War II. It's a problem with inclusion in video games, and Kingdom Come Deliverance serves as a prime example. It was criticized for not being diverse enough in ethnic groups when the only 3 ethnic groups in Bohemia in 14th century Bohemia, never mind you, were only the Germans, Czechs, and Jews, the latter being treated rather poorly and were poor themselves. So tell me how that makes sense to have black people in there. Please, somebody explain that. This notion that everybody should be included in games has to stop. Let me say this again. This has to stop. When game companies try to play the game of inclusion, then who do you include? Not everybody's going to be represented in a video game. That is a fact, because it's going to be a strain on the studio, the artists, and everybody behind the scenes working on the game. You can't include everybody. It's just not feasible. I'm going to post a quote from the DICE dev on screen. Just let this sink in. Yeah. DICE and EA tried to sell this as an authentic, immersive World War II experience. Yeah, like it's gonna be immersive and authentic when we have women with prosthetics arms running around the field. Dear Lord. No one is discrediting the work that women did in World War II. Hell, they were the backbone for most countries. America, like I stated earlier, had 350,000 women sign up for the army to make ships, planes, guns, ammunition, all that stuff in factories. They also served as nurses and saved lives as well. Just because they didn't do frontline combat doesn't mean that they didn't do anything. They did a whole hell of a lot. Let me reiterate this. I have no problems with women in video games. Just make it make sense. Like I said earlier, if you want females in World War II on the front lines, French resistance or the Soviet Union is your best bet because it makes sense. Fighting for the Allies with a prosthetic arm does not make sense. See what I'm getting at? Along with that same line of thought, if you wanted to include ethnic diversity, make it make sense. For example, America's 442nd Regiment, an all-Japanese regiment. They are the most decorated unit in World War II. I mean, it would be nice to see that referenced. My point is that if you wanted to include diversity of any kind, make it make sense. And if you pull nonsense like this, it just insults World War II, especially with the fact that DICE and EA had no intention of saying it was alternative history. People are wanting to turn history a fact-based and record-based timeline of events into alt history because it doesn't fit their political agendas. As a person who loves history, history is not politically correct by today's standards. So please take that fake history elsewhere. Look, people have to remember that societal guidelines were different. I don't know how people don't know that. It's like obvious. Back in the 1800s, it was okay to enslave black people for labor. That's a fact. That's why the Civil War happened. That's why the Civil Rights happened 100 years later. There are awful things in history, but they are in times in which society was different. Basically, every bit of history affects our world today. We're stuck in a nuclear arms race because of the atomic bombs that were dropped over Japan on August 6th and August 9th of 1945. Women's rights grew stronger after World War II because they enjoyed working. The tension between North Korea and South Korea exists today because of the Korean War in the 1950s. We're stuck in the Middle East because of the United States' decision to intervene during the Cold War by supplying weapons and ammo to groups who we thought stood for democracy. This has to stop with our historical games, and it sets a precedent where we can just throw out history whenever we feel like it because we don't agree with it. I don't agree with the bombing of Japan during August 6th and August 9th. Does that mean I'm going to chuck it out of the history books? No. It's important. It's part of the history. It's important to learn from these events because if we don't, we end up repeating the same things over and over again. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the point of history. So again, developers, stop tainting it with your political agendas. Please.